Today we live in a society that claims to no longer deal in absolutes, to be beyond the naivete of believing it has a catch-all for everything, or even if for anything at all. Hegel claims philosophy has always been, is, and will be seeking after the absolute, with a capital A, and claiming for itself the standpoint of what it has discovered and considers such. What is an absolute anyway? Hegel takes it to be the standpoint which is the ultimate explanatory principle, that is, the thought or concept which explains all others. This form of absolute can take on an amazing variety of shapes, ranging from abstract universal ideas to the everydayness of sense feeling. The absolute may be for us the being of Parmenides, the shunyata or emptiness of Buddha, the will of Schopenhauer, consciousness, the law of sufficient reason, power, love, genes, memes, naturalism, the principle of deterministic mechanics, or the very nothingness of nihilism. The absolute is, to put it another way, the ultimate meaning of the world. It doesn't matter what we say about our denial of the word absolute. We nonetheless, in fact, act, live, and judge according to the unconscious absolute standpoint. The coward's absolute is self above all. The lover's absolute is the beloved above all. The capitalist's absolute is profit above all. The relativist's absolute may be the flat equality of all these subjective standpoints which do not overbear on other subjects. The world is subsumed under the absolute principle, and all else is thrown into the abyss for its sake. There is in all these possible conceptions an open hole for attack. There are significant reasons to deny that these concepts really explain everything as they claim. There is more to our world than being, shunyata, will, and consciousness. They do not in fact explain everything. External factors must be brought in or denied if needing explanation. For being, non-being is illusion, and change is impossible. For shunyata, the self is an illusion, and permanence or substance or essence is a figment, etc. The principle of sufficient reason likewise cannot explain everything, especially itself, nor can any of the others. Mechanism likewise cannot explain everything, certainly not chemistry, let alone life. Complete explanation, then, is one of the core structures of the absolute, if it is to serve the function we require of it. The absolute must also have, along with its completeness of explanation, an objective universal claim over and against all other claims on its domain. That is, it must have the measure of reason which it and it alone can have to stand above all others. Were we to have more than one absolute principle, with no common ground from which a criterion may be applied to judge which is best, or if equal at all, we would have from both a failure, the failure to explain the existence of the other, something outside their scope of explanation. This failure to explain the other would only imply that the absolute is actually what is above them, that which divides and unites them. And it would only reveal that what we thought was absolute is in fact relative in explanation and relative in being. We find in human experience this common ground in which the criterion must reside to be reason itself. For from it and it alone arises the very question of this criterion and justification of claims. To deny that reason is the arbiter of truth is a self-defeating claim, for one has stepped into the realm of reason and justification, and one must provide rational justification for this. Whatever the absolute may be, reason is the one seeking it, and only it alone could speak of an absolute which can be accessed by all, not just by the lucky few who experience enlightening intuition. As complete explanation, the absolute has yet another aspect, complete independence. The absolute must alone explain the entirety of all other things, and in the case of the concept of absolute, there cannot be dependence on external considerations to explain anything. This independence implies something further. The absolute, as complete explanation, necessarily must explain itself. Were it incapable of explaining itself, there would be either a further factor that would be implied to explain it, or there would be a lack of universal rational force in it which would verify it as the absolute explanation for all rational subjects. Mystics and religious dogmatists, for this reason, fail to convince many of their claims to know the absolute, for their absolutes are, in the literal sense, a mystery to reason. and supposedly knowable only for the blessed few who are allowed to step into the mystery and know it through feeling intuition rather than intellect. Because nothing can be outside the Absolute, this implies totality. Because the Absolute, as totality, has nothing else to relate to but itself, this implies reflexivity. Hegel famously says in many places, "The true is the whole." Many of us make a mistake, however, when we think that the truth as the whole is simply an abstraction, like Parmenides' being. All is, it is the universal, it is the unchanging. But change is real, difference is real. Therefore, the Absolute must account for this, and it must include it. If we shift to the complete opposite end, and we go only with change and the endless flux as real, we must account for the appearance of stability. We must account for the substantiality of things, why they endure, how they can endure. Or as Hegel puts it, the Absolute is substance and subject at once. The static and dynamic are one and the same. Being and nothing are one and the same. How can this be? How is this possible? The whole which the Absolute comprises is a whole not as a mere completed end as the final position, but as the very way the whole has come about. Thus, the Absolute is the whole process of the Absolute. The Absolute by its own concept must include everything within itself. Not even nothing, non-being, can be outside it. One cannot have the whole, the result, content, or unity on one side, and the parts, process, form, or difference on another. To grasp a concept which can contain everything in their full determinate difference and contradiction, yet is not an empty abstraction like pure being, is one of the great barriers to understanding Hegel's philosophy. This whole is a whole that is only by virtue of its parts, and its parts are parts only by virtue of their respective place within the context of the whole. Or, this unity is only by virtue of the differences which compose it, and said differences only are differences insofar as they find themselves in a united whole. Or, the substance can only be by virtue of its own action, which maintains it as substance, this action being its subjectivity, itself. It is a process which exists because of its products, and its products exist because of its process. So the Absolute is all. This everything of the Absolute, however, is not the endless detail of empirical existence. This is not to say that the Absolute does not include nature's empirical existence, for the Absolute as thought determines itself against what is not a thought, that is, sensuous existence. Given that the determinate content of sensuous experience is not itself a thought as merely mental image or conceptual linguistic articulation, it nonetheless has the structures of thought as concepts, which in a literal sense inform sense objects, or rather, they are the very form. They are the very way that objects, in reality, determine themselves as the objects that they are. We see in sense experience always something to conceive about it, some thought structure that minimally conveys a universal structure of things, even if not the sensuous content itself. For example, the color red at least can be spoken about as a quality, if nothing else. The Absolute is not the complete grasping of all empirical facts or qualities, but rather of the intelligibility which inheres in all things and reveals itself as their essence and logical structures, even if all that is intelligible in an object is revealed only to be precisely its unintelligibility or contingency. Even the acknowledgement of an empirical experience as a mere individual with no universal repetition, the notion of said individuality, is itself universal. It is individual because it is opposed to the universal. To make it clear, the difference between the empirical and the intelligible Absolute here has to do with the difference between quantity and quality. When regarding the Absolute as knowledge, the meaning of absolute knowledge is not that we know every empirical fact, that is, the position and velocity of every quark in the universe. That's not what is meant. What is meant is that we know the why and the how of quarks as such, the why and the how of everything. Of course, when one first sees it, that seems like a tall order, even for that very little determined amount. How do we know that we know every kind of thing in the universe, for example? We don't know that. How can we claim to have absolute knowledge? Well, you'd be right. We indeed may not know everything. As a matter of fact, we clearly don't know everything. We know very little. Nonetheless, we can at least be certain with Hegel's logic, insofar as he claims, that is up to you to find out, that we know with absolute certainty the absolute form of absolute knowledge. Though we may not know all the truths out in the universe, we know what all these truths would look like if they were true. But what are true things? Well, for one, Hegel thinks they're certainly rational, and the absolute is the totality of what rationally is, how it has come to be, what it is, and what it is coming to be. Rational because it is intelligible. True being because it is what endures in vanishing appearances. All things partake in the absolute, but no particular thing is the lone privileged ground of the absolute. The absolute as such is not a standpoint like the relative concepts that comprise it, for it is the absolute concept, the whole, in which all others are relative as its parts. Its conceptual content is the entire system of fully developed scientific concepts, and thus it has no definition other than this entire development. One could say the absolute is simply the concept of the conception of concepts. To those who have not endeavored to enter and work through the system that Hegel has built up, the absolute is nothing but an empty phrase, a nebulous shadow with the faintest shape. Now, I mentioned concepts. What's this whole idealism stuff, by the way? Concepts, as unifying structures, are the intelligibility to everything which serves as such a structure, including non-mental things. Repeating, concepts are unifying structures, mental or otherwise. When the development of Hegel's science closes in on itself and finally points back to the beginning such that absolute spirit closes with the pinnacle of philosophy and connects back to the science of logic, this closure of the systems of logic, nature, and spirit is the concept of the absolute finally come to its known as the concept, of which all other concepts are shown to be a part of. This concept, like all other concepts, is a unified structure consisting of systems, the concepts of logic, nature, and spirit, and it is the most complex and mediated concept of them all. Its content is the entire developed system into which the thinker and thinking of the absolute themselves are taken into. Unlike all other concepts which find themselves transcended as they are shown to be relative, the absolute has no other transcendence beyond it. Its transcendence is an inner self-transcendence as finite and relative moments, but this self-transcendent process remains wholly within itself in all its developments. The absolute thus shows itself to be a process with moments of identity and difference in respective views, a restless becoming that is, in its restlessness, at rest, and to be in its products the famous circle of circles. The absolute transcends all, and then transcends itself only to keep returning back to itself. There's nowhere else to go. The absolute is what it is. But it is only this endless activity of self-negation, self-determination, self-differentiation, self-transcendence. Transcendence transcends transcendence. What is it now? Still transcendence. To completely butcher it in order to give a summary, the absolute is ultimately nothing but the completed process of the unity which dirempts itself, and which in its diremption returns to unity. In the absolute, unity and difference are of equal importance. There is no unity without difference, and no difference without unity. The absolute is a process which becomes other to itself in its own immanence. That is, in being itself, it becomes other than itself, while remaining wholly itself. Its completion as system is nothing but the full course through the finite self-determinations, which of their own immanent content and form go beyond themselves as the finite modes of the absolute. The system is itself only the result of an absolute method, an absolute activity, with a unity of content and form which alone can yield the absolute. For an absolute content only an absolute form and method can do. This process come to full closure, where it can generate nothing new within itself, is alone the true, intelligible absolute. From unities which show themselves relative and divided, to differences which show themselves necessarily united, the absolute looms as their immanent truth and nature. Process is, I think, one of the terms which best captures the strangeness of the absolute. Process is both becoming and being, for in common understanding a being undergoes process. Hegel's philosophy differs from common understanding in that for it process and being are immanently united as being and becoming. They are one and the same. Being becomes in simply being itself. In fact, that is all that being is. Being is becoming. In the science of logic, this is epitomized in this. The thought of being is necessarily the thinking of being, and in thinking being, it has already become nothing. It is in the intimacy of thought and thinking that we find ourselves somehow both able and unable to split being and its becoming in the experience of thought as thinking. That is, without thinking, a thought as concept is no thought at all. Hegel's Absolute has very much to do with everything in the logic and everything else in his philosophy. Probably the easiest form of it that one can grasp at first is the so-called true infinite in the science of logic. To leave you with a concrete image of the absolute, a picture that you can wrap your mind around, think of nothing but an orange tree. An orange tree not simply as an orange tree, however, but in the truth of what it is in the world system. It is part of an ecology, it is part of particularly its own absolute life form, the species that it is. The absolute includes all moments and exists as all moments, and it cannot be otherwise. And each moment exists because of its role in the absolute, and the absolute exists only because all of its finite particulars exist. Each tree germinates in the soil when its conditions of existence are met. It grows, matures, produces flowers, produces fruits, cross-pollinates with the other trees. The fruit ripens, falls to the ground, desiccates. The seeds lie on the soil, are taken by animals, buried, eaten, pooped. And eventually, when the conditions of existence for the seed are met again, it germinates, and the cycle of life continues. Everything that is orange trees exists for the sake of the species. But the species only exists for the sake of producing more of its members. The individual exists for the whole, and the whole for the individual. That is the absolute. This has only been a broad overview of the absolute. There is much more to say on this topic, but suffice to say, entire books have been written about it. Once again, this has been Antonio Wolf. Thank you for listening. See you around.